Thank you all for coming today. It's good to see you on this hot and humid Sunday. The title of the sermon today, and you may have seen it alluded to with my wife Camille's children's message, is Faith in Times of Distraction, the intellectual, personal, and social. And so today as I speak, there's going to be sort of three sections to this sermon. The first is sort of a calling for us to really allow the intellectual dimension of our faith to flourish. The second piece is, once we've done this from an intellectual perspective, how does that work personally for us in our daily lives? And then the final piece is, as we look out into the world with this strong faith and a personal faith, how do we actually let that flourish in the general public in order to bring about God's kingdom in the best way that we can? So those are the sort of overviews of my sermon today. So as we turn our attention to the readings, we just read the familiar passage of the wise servant that keeps his lamp lit, waiting in faith for his master to return. An obvious call to diligently maintain our faith as we await the return of Christ, not knowing when that's going to come. The question for us lamp holders at Pilgrim today is not the grinding poverty and oppression experienced by first century Christian brothers and sisters, but rather the daily digital distractions, and that's a term from the American Psychology Association, not from myself, and increasing chaos of the world around us. Just this week, we've read about major military exercises around Taiwan, new offensives in the Ukraine, monkeypox declared a national emergency, all kinds of political strife and disagreements around the issues of the day, and the list goes on and on. At the same time, the prominent scholar and psychologist, Jonathan Haidt, describes the impact of social media on our culture as a modern-day Tower of Babel moment, where the forces of TikTok, Twitter, YouTube, Tumblr, Facebook, etc., seem to be rendering us unable to understand and listen to each other at a basic level. We are truly, at times, it seems, a nation divided. And yet, we turn to our gospel today in Luke 12, and we see the heading of the paragraph in which it sits, and it reads, "We do not worry." We find our hope in the faith that, as Paul says in Romans 8:28, we know that in all things God works for the good of those who love him, who have been called according to his purpose. And make no mistake, anyone who's here, anyone who serves in the church, anyone who felt motivated to walk through the doors today is indeed called by God for a purpose. And so when we read this, this is directly pointing to us. I want to discuss three perspectives on this faith today. First, how a biblically correct definition of faith encourages us to confidently explore the intellectual basis for our beliefs and worldview. Secondly, I want to briefly discuss the biblical patterns of faith that are alluded to in our reading from Hebrews today, and the testing in the Old Testament, and the importance of putting God first in our personal lives, putting him at the center of our orbit, so to speak. And lastly, I want to close reminding us of the splendor of the kingdom. Christ brought to our earth a kingdom that is much bigger than our daily issues. It is something that is transcendent and beautiful and that needs to be imagined, that maybe we don't even have the capacity to imagine on our own, maybe that we need to be in a community of faith to truly imagine. So I want to leave you with some images of that so that we can see the beauty of it and the power as we go back into our normal lives this week. So the intellectual. So how do we precisely define faith? I think faith, unfortunately, in our modern culture has gotten a bad rap. In the U.S., we live in what is essentially a scientific materialist society that has a stark divide between secular and faithful. And that's creeped into our own Webster's dictionary. When you look up faith in the Webster's dictionary, it says belief without evidence. And unfortunately, I've heard many people, both on the atheistic side and on the side of God, represent this in a way that does not give confidence to our faith in God. However, the Oxford scholar John Lennox points out that in the original translation, faith was formed out of the root fides, which is where we get the word fidelity. So I have to give credit to our British friends because in the Oxford dictionary, faith is defined as confidence, reliance, and belief proceeding from reliance on testimony or authority. And that is consistent with the way that faith is defined today in Hebrews. And so I think it's important for us to realize that when we see faith kind of bandied about in the general world, it isn't necessarily this original first century meaning that, say, Christ would have meant when he said these words. And so when we think about faith for the rest of the sermon, we're going to think about confidence and reliance, and that being based on evidence and our best thoughts. So a significant dimension to the power of this gospel, and the reason why we're still talking about it 2,000 years later, something that happened with a carpenter in Nazareth, then a whole other part of the world, is that there is extensive evidence for it. The beautiful and effortless integration between the New Testament and Old Testament, the archaeological evidence confirming key historical figures and locales, extra-biblical historical writings on Jesus and early Christians, discovery of earlier and earlier manuscripts of the Gospels that have strong continuity to current translations, Gospels and epistles based on eyewitness testimony based on how they were written, and coherence in key theological themes across what is a very complicated philosophy. All of these things, we could go on and on about, and we could have an entire class on, but all of these things are what's provided confidence to scholars going back thousands of years who have chosen to follow this faith. And so I bring a quote from C.S. Lewis to make us think about this. He says, "If Christianity is false, it is of no importance, and if true, is of infinite importance. The only thing it cannot be is moderately important." And so given that, how much of our faith on a daily basis do we take for granted? We kind of live it as a pattern of life, as how we were raised. Maybe we grew up in the Lutheran church and our parents are from there. But what's the last time we really thought about it? You know, for some of us, we just know. Some of us, it's planted in our heart. We look into the world and we see beauty and we see meaning and we see agency, and we don't need to spend the time reviewing the data, so to speak, and looking at the evidence. But myself, I was not satisfied by that. Before I really became a fully committed Christian, I had to look at the data. And it is there. The data is there. And so I urge all of you that there is nothing more important than understanding the roots of our faith and beliefs, and that it is worth doing the digging. And so whether you're reading books like The Case for Christ by Lee Strobel from the Chicago area, The Most Reluctant Convert is a film that was recently put out talking about C.S. Lewis's conversion to Christianity, The Resurrection of Jesus Christ, probably the best book on the philosophy and evidence feeding into the resurrection of Jesus, or The Reason for God, a recent really readable book by Tim Keller. There's all of these resources that are out there that we can pick up and benefit from the work that's been done justifying our faith. And so that's point number one, is there is an intellectual dimension to faith, and we need to foster that, and God puts in our hearts the desire to do that. And so we have these great resources. If there's ever something you want to talk about, feel free to ask me questions. I can point you to those. The second point is the personal. So we can look at the intellectual, and sometimes there's actually a risk in that. We can say intellectualize a concept and not really live it out. And so the second discussion point for today is to look at this personal side and the need for the supremacy of God in our day-to-day walk. We have this wonderful section from Hebrews 11, 2 through 24, and it was kind of parsed out today in our reading. But if you see the whole reading, it goes through a comprehensive set of Old Testament patterns of keeping the faith, starting from Adam and Eve and going all the way to the prophets that came before Jesus, to Isaiah. We saw the part on Abraham as one of the key examples of that, but it goes through all of them. And what it's trying to show is that faith in God and putting him first is the dominant pattern in the Old Testament. And it's also the dominant way that humans tend to fail, unfortunately. So as amazing as these various prophets are, when they face these tests, they have a mixed bag of results. For every manna from heaven, where the remnant that is in the wilderness relying on God for bread coming from heaven, there's also a story of striking the stone for water, for not believing that God's going to provide and wanting to use God as a magic trick. We learned during Lent, as we closely went through Jonah, that he heard a direct call from God to go to Nineveh. And what did he do? He ran in the other direction, right? And that's something that as humans we tend to do. We can be truly disobedient, but more often we just think we know better. The apple is just too alluring. And so I want you to know that this pattern of faith and this pattern of testing and this mixed bag of us being able to, on our own, be able to actually pass those tests is sort of a dominant pattern that goes through all of the Old Testament. So when you're going back and reading that, keep that in the back of your mind. There are so many idols, we learn, that can compete with God. Technology, as in today, is in screens for both us adults and kids. Politics, getting caught up in the politics of the day and judging people primarily based on that. Career, identity, relationships, knowledge, vices, and even things that are noble, like our children and grandchildren, can become the top of our value hierarchy and become above God and turn into idols for us. In Hebrews 11, 17, 19, we read what is perhaps my favorite analogy of this in the Old Testament. And it's not the one that's actually in our reading today, but it is about Abraham. It's Hebrews 11:17-19. By faith, Abraham, when God tested him, again, this concept of testing, offered Isaac as a sacrifice. He who had embraced the promises was about to sacrifice his one and only son. And of course, that's going to sound familiar to us as Christians as we think about God giving up his only son. Even though God had said to him, "It is through Isaac that your offspring will be reckoned," Abraham reasoned that God could even raise the dead, and so in a manner of speaking, he did receive Isaac back from the dead. And so what we learn is that Abraham desperately wanted a child. He had been promised an heir that his descendants would spring from. And when he finally got it, that became the most important thing in the world to him, even more important than God. And so as God takes him into the wilderness and tests him to sacrifice his own son, Abraham actually follows this, takes his son up and fully intends to sacrifice his son on the altar. And just before he does, of course, we all know that God stops him from doing so. But the moment that God stops him, Abraham realizes that at that moment, given that he was willing to go through with it, his son is actually a gift to him from God. And that is sort of the metaphor here, is that everything that we have in our lives that's beautiful, that's noteworthy, that is worth repeating, is a gift from God. And therefore, we have to love our family members, our jobs, everything in our lives that's good through Jesus and through Christ. So we need to prioritize that at the top of our value hierarchy, because everything in our lives that's of meaning comes through him. And so thinking about sort of the original creation and looking at some of our forefathers and the sacrifices they were willing to make helps give us the sort of metaphors we need to inspire us on that. So in our personal lives, as we love those people around us, that agape love must first pass through God. If we think of our loves as planets in the solar system, as Camille alluded to, God is at the center, with our family, friends, and career expanding further and further out into orbits that are a little bit less important. The gravitational force that holds these together is the strength of our faith, even in times of trial when that faith is not easy to have. And so we prioritize our loves. Augustine, the great theologian, would have said ordering of our loves. We order those, and what holds all that together and what keeps God at the top is that faith. And that faith, as I started the sermon with, is based on our reasoning and our evidence and digging in to the details of our God. Okay, so lastly, we've gone through the intellectual aspects of faith and digging into that, and that being a worthwhile thing to do. We've gone into how that means to us personally and how we have all these examples from the Old Testament to show us how to prioritize God above all else and see everything as springing from him. The last piece is, how do we face out into the world with this? So I close with a reflection on the kingdom that we are helped to create in our social context. The statement, "Store up your treasures in heaven where moth and vermin do not destroy," from both Luke and Matthew, is a stark reminder to live with an eternal mindset. During his trial, Jesus reminded Pontius Pilate in John 18:36 that my kingdom is not of this world. And that's when Pontius Pilate asked him, are you the king of the Jews? When Jesus came to this earth, Luke shows you throughout that entire gospel, the direct focus was not on the headlines of the day. I mean, everyone was interested in Rome. What are we going to do about Rome? What are we going to do about these kingdoms? How are we going to get the temple rebuilt and functioning the way it used to? How are we going to bring David back and restore the power of Israel? That's not what Jesus was focused on in the near term. When he came to this earth, he wasn't focused on those headlines, but instead focused on new creation, the creation of a new humanity. What he was aiming at was so much bigger than what was in the minds of the people. He had a focus on the poor. And the original translation of poor in Luke, this is from the Bible Project, from Tim Mackey. The original, when we read poor, we tend to think of economically poor, people who don't have money. But poor in a biblical context meant an outcast, someone who might not have very much money, someone who might be disliked, someone like a Samaritan who is outside of the normal boundaries of society, someone like a tax collector who, as a result of taking that job, could not be welcomed into the kingdom. And you'll notice, as you read through Luke, that he begins with that concept of the poor, and then he tells stories about Jesus reaching out to all of those individual groups that I just said. And so it shows how he's building this new kingdom. That's where his focus was. He didn't come down and say, what's wrong with Rome? He kind of came down and said, what's wrong with you? What's wrong with the society that we're building? Are we really building a kingdom that offers an alternative to what we're complaining about? That's really sort of, in a way, where God was really focusing at that point. And so he was focused on the blind, the crippled, the economically dispossessed, tax collectors, Samaritans, and prostitutes, namely those that had been relegated to the outside of society. Tim Mackey from the Bible Project aptly names this the upside-down kingdom. The first will be the last, the wise will be the fools, from Paul. The first invited to the banquet will not be the first to arrive. These are all concepts that kind of come through the Gospels and show us this upside-down kingdom. And so, as expected, we see that what Jesus represents is so much more than our daily distractions and conflicts. He invites us to look up and put our minds on the ultimate mission, being image-bearing disciples that act as instruments of God's vision to serve the poor and grow the kingdom. And that's really what this church and what all the Christian churches are all about, or should be. This can be hard to see from our vantage point in the West. I mean, we think of Christianity as being useful to us in some ways. Like if you live this moral life and you live these patterns of life, you will tend to flourish more and benefit society more. You'll be seen as better. You know, we have this in the back of our minds. And that's in large part due to the hard work that our ancestors have done to get us to where we are today. But if you read something like the Acts of the Apostles that Luke also wrote, you see many disciples who duplicated the pattern that Christ lived, giving their own lives on this earth to store up treasures in heaven. They had to make the ultimate sacrifice. They did not benefit in the short term from the way that they lived. They actually gave their lives for it. They gave the exact opposite sacrifice. Think about Dietrich Bonhoeffer, perhaps the most famous Lutheran. He died at the hand of the Nazis. It would have been much easier for him to sit there and just kind of disagree with the Nazis and keep it to himself. Instead, he stood up. What motivated him to reach for that kind of vision? And it's only the faith that he had that there was something that was much greater than is on this earth. Ironically, if we do live those kinds of kingdom-bearing lives with our eyes on the transcendent, I think our woes on the earth do begin to change for the better, and probably in the most maximal way. And so we learn that these trials that we face that may cause us to question our faith are actually what solidify our faith. And acting in the principles of God in that kind of trials and tribulations is what brings that kingdom forth. That's exactly what the whole point is. And it's the examples that are listed out in our readings in Hebrews today. So, finally, it is not often stated that Jesus never referred to himself as the Christ. This was a huge surprise to me, although I think I kind of knew it, but no one had ever told it to me, if that makes sense. He usually refers to himself in the Gospels as the Son of Man, and he does at the end of Luke, when the Son of Man returns. What does that mean? In that cultural context, that was an Old Testament echo that would immediately evoke a tremendous image in the minds of the Jewish reader. To help you have that experience, I want to close with that reading so that you can have the same feeling that they would have had when he referred to that. So from Daniel 7, 13 through 14. In my vision at night I looked, and there before me was one like a son of man, coming with the clouds of heaven. He approached the Ancient of Days and was led into his presence. He was given authority, glory, and sovereign power. All nations and peoples of every language worshiped him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion that will not pass away, and his kingdom is one that will never be destroyed. And that's why we have nothing to fear. All right, thank you.